when you look at your life in retrospective, how do you feel about it?
How do we feel about my life?
In retrospective, yeah.
I love my life. I had, it's hard to explain, but I say I had a perfect life. I had a perfect wife. I mean, my wife was just the most fabulous woman in the whole world. I mean, she was perfect. And I had, I didn't say I didn't work for it. I did work for it. I worked for everything I got. And I just love my wife. I love my job. I love my kids. I love my grandkids. I love my cars. I love my hobbies. I love my homes.
I'll take note that he does love his cars more than he loves his grandkids.
Well, cars are another story. Okay, go for it, man. I'll try not to lie. The initial neighborhood I remember was in the East Bronx. That was the one that was near the park, the Bronx Park. We lived as a family, never knew we were poor through the Depression years, and we never knew we knew we weren't rich, but we never knew that we were poor. And we had other relatives that were poor, lived in the slums more or less. We lived in a pretty nice neighborhood, tree line, 5-family home, and we did it for many, many years, never realizing that we were poor. New York was an interesting place. You had neighborhoods, close, narrow neighborhoods. Like, we lived in basically a Jewish neighborhood. I would say that we were 70% Jewish, probably 25% Italian. If you went a few blocks in another direction, you would go into an Irish neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And that's the way the areas were laid out in those days. What I remember of my parents is that I understood that my mother was born in Kiev. That's the town that's in the news today. And she came with her mother at a babe in arms at 1 year old. And all her siblings were born in America. She was the only one of her siblings that was not born in America. And she was, of course, she became a citizen. My father came, a Jewish man who came from the middle of Russia. There was a town called Vitebsk. I don't know a whole lot about it, except that I know my grandfather was a wealthy man, considered at the times a wealthy man. And I know my father had a sister that was a dentist and a brother that was a doctor. And because they were kind of valued during World War II, they survived. The Kropotkin family survived World War II. My father, however, came over in 1911, came over to America with a cousin and a friend. Kind of, my dad was kind of the black sheep of the family or whatever, but he came to America and he served in the military during World War I. He served in France in the U.S. Army and was a model citizen. And he worked, I remember my dad worked his head off for his family. He was a house painter, and he would spend winters working in summer residences, painting them. And he did whatever he could to earn a living during the Depression. I would always tell people that I had 4 mothers.
Right.
My father would work anywhere he could to provide for his family. And all things considered, we lived pretty well. But again, he was away a lot, so I was really at the mercy of my sisters, who kept me in line, and they really did. I had 3 older sisters. My oldest sister was 9 years older, and then the next one was 6 years older, the next one was 3 years older.
When Ken was born, how did it change the family immediately?
Well, it changed the fact that my mother felt at least she had a boy. I remember us talking, Daddy Ethel and I talking about a boy, you know, we have a little boy, brother. And she gave birth in the house. There was no hospital, you didn't go to the hospital in those days. You had a family doctor, and he came to the house, and well, at least that's what I think. My memory was that he was born in the apartment.
Right.
And it was a wonderment after 3 girls. I mean, just to see a little penis was even something that we had never seen before. When you diapered a baby, we didn't, at that age, we didn't think of penises, but I was like, he's got that additional thing.
I think I grew up respecting women, and I think it showed then, and it shows that way today.
Kenneth was the most, Kenneth was the most adorable thing. I mean, as good as you were, he was better. I mean, you were adorable, he was more adorable, because he had a personality that was so cute. There's nothing he could do that you could hate him. It was impossible. You couldn't be angry at him. So I couldn't be angry at him because he was a boy who followed me and I was a 3rd daughter. How could I be angry with him? He was so adorable.
Why you got into show business, you and your siblings? What was the driving force in that?
The driving force was my mother.
My mother was a fantastic lady. She ran her household. She wasn't in the greatest of health, but she took care of the children, and she did everything she had to do as a mother, and she was a show business mother. We were all, her whole family, her kids, the 4 kids, were all in show business from the time we were infants, virtually. And she just thrived in that. She was just a very ambitious woman for the times.
This was the time, as I said, of Shirley Temple. Up until then, there had been no children's stars. That was a new thing. When sound came in, you know, I don't know when it came in precisely, but they certainly didn't have too many children actors. And Shirley Temple set the mode. She became every mother's dream to get out of the house, to become famous, even though she didn't think of it that way. It was a way out of looking at yourself as if you're always going to be poor or always going to be in this same situation. And then when they begin to realize that they're bored, that really starts them looking elsewhere. Where can they go? And that's when Shirley Temple became a star. She was as big as any big movie star there is around. And she became a road out of poverty to a lot of people, and also a way of getting out of the house. When then they knew now, okay, we can give, and they could hide behind the fact that these I want it for my children. You know, I want best for them.
Right.
But it was really a quest for themselves to get out of boredom, the boredom of the house.
My oldest sisters, she really didn't feel at all comfortable in show business. And she did it for a while, but she studied the piano more on her own. And she wasn't really that heavily involved as my sister Dorothy. My sister Ethel was my oldest sister. And my sister Dorothy, who was the glamour girl, who ultimately became a comedian for many, many years. She worked all over town. My sister Dorothy did her comedy work during World War II. She served in the USO. She served in France, and she was a very interesting comedian. She did it every winter. She spent the winters in Florida in a nightclub. And Judy was very active when she was young, and ultimately moved to California and became a screenwriter.
I had a very great fear, what's the word?
Stage fright.
Stage fright. And, but I would just go against it. And that really helped me in life. But I kept it up anyway, because at that point, what was my alternative? To be ordinary was a no-no in my family. You had to be a movie star on the rise. You had to be something that wasn't ordinary. Ordinary kids, what did they know?
And I just was a tap dancer. And I would tap dance when I would come home from school. Today I consider myself that in those days that I was an athlete. I would come home from school and I would tap dance for hours at home because nobody was home. And I would just tap dance and tap dance and tap dance till I would be ready to fall down. And so I considered myself an athlete. And I think I built my body into an athlete because I just tap danced like hell. Hours. We worked in two basically different groups. One was a group that was organized by a female dancer. And so we did a lot of dance routines. I danced with my sisters. I danced with Judy. We did a lot of different numbers. One was called Down by the Gas House. We did continue into show business pretty much up until World War II. Once Dorothy left to go overseas, kind of my show business career sputtered to an end. I got involved in photography almost accidentally. One of my friends, a Jewish boy who was bar mitzvahed, and somebody gave him a photography developing and printing kit, which consisted of trays for chemicals, a light for your darkroom, and a print and a frame so that you could print negatives by exposing them to light, putting them in the chemistry, and that's how you made prints. And so I bought this set from him. He didn't want it. I paid him $2 for it. And that $2 started my career in photography. I had my little room, tiny little room in the front of the building. And I remember setting up a chenille blanket over the window. And that's how I started my darkroom.
We called it the dungeon because Kenneth always kept curtains there so he could have a dark room. And he had these heavy velvet curtains. And then we called it the dungeon. But he was, it made me completely, competitive. And I've always been competitive because I had to compete for attention.
My father gave me a camera which he had purchased years ago. It was a camera that actually took postcard-sized pictures. It was probably one of the best consumer cameras that Kodak ever made in those days. And that's how I started in photography. That was the start. And of course, I remember my mother used to agonize, and she used to say, "Why don't you move the curtain, get some light in the in the room?" She would say to me, "Kenneth, you're going to get consumption. Open the blind." But that was my life, and I went on from there. And as time went by, my sister Ethel, my oldest sister Ethel, she got a job in probably the first trade magazine for television in New York City. And she went to work for this magazine, and they had a freelance photographer that worked for them by the name of Jerry Salzberg. And he was like an older brother to me. Now I'm talking about a time now when I'm in high school. And now I'm 14 years old. And met this Jerry, who was a tremendous photographer, but he was all outgoing. He had no studio. He only had a dark room in Midtown Manhattan. And so I would, after school, go down to his dark room and deliver all his packages. He did work for many of the insurance companies. He would go on location and take pictures of their new executives or the parties for some of these corporations, and they would use them in their magazines, their company magazines. And so Jerry was a busy guy, and I worked with him, and it just so happens that he used a lot of equipment that was the equipment that was being used in the New York press. And so it was a very good education for me working with him and for him, is that when I was in high school, I was learning to use the photography that was being used in the press. Jerry was an interesting man. I remember in those days when I would be in the darkroom, models would keep coming up and they wanted people to give them their portfolio, and so Jerry would sometimes help, sometimes he would do a little more, but whatever. But I was just a kid, and I enjoyed it, and he loaned me cameras, and it was just really neat until I got a little older and I was able to get cameras on my own. And at that point, I decided Jerry was going to get me a job in the business. I was getting close to graduating high school. I had a very interesting life in high school. It was an all-boys school, and I was the photo editor of the high school newspaper. I played in the band, in the orchestra. I played bass fiddle. I had a very interesting life in high school, but it was time to move on and think about my future. And Jerry said, "Ken, I can't hire you, but I will get you a job." And Jerry got me an interview. Well, I don't even know if I should mention it, but it was the Macy's Corporation in New York. And Macy's had their own photo staff, which did all their advertising photography, not public photography. And so I was introduced to the head of their advertising photography staff, who interviewed me and said, "You're just the kind of guy we want, a young kid we could train our way, and so you're hired." And so I was hired at 18 years old at Macy's. unfortunately, I never heard from Macy's. and and I'm not too sure why, but I have a feeling that I had a sister that worked for them. Maybe her record wasn't too well. Anyway, it didn't matter. But while I was waiting to hear from Macy's, which I still haven't heard from them all these years, I applied in a newspaper advertisement that was looking for temporary office people, not boys, at the New York Daily News. They had a situation that they were working on separate from the regular paper. There was a newspaper strike in Chicago of the composing room or something like that. And the Daily News was bracing for that strike hitting New York. And so they set up a operation in the Daily News building. The Daily News building, the editorial department was on the 7th floor. All the reporting and photography work was done on the 7th floor. The setup that they did was away from anything they did because they wanted to see if there was a strike, they wanted to see if they could continue publishing the paper without the composing room people. So they set up a special operation on the 30th floor. So they hired about eight of us, office boys or girls. We had some women too, girls, and we would run the stories and be the liaison between the 7th floor and the 30th floor. So we would be going back and forth, doing our work for the bypass if it was ever necessary. But the strike was settled, so the operation was shut down. But I had made contacts with all the people. The one person I needed was the head copy boy who ran all the copy boys in the paper, which were many, and he ran them from the 7th floor. And I went over to him and I said, "Could I work for you?" And he liked me. Okay, I was always a hard-working kid. So he said, "Fine, you're hired." So then I got a job when I was 18 as a regular Daily News employee. And I think after 6 months, you were in the union. So they could fire you, they could do whatever they want the first 6 months, but I had a good reputation, so I didn't have a problem, and I became a copy boy. Within 6 months, I got into the photo department, and I was a tech. We did all the dirty work, so to speak, in the photo department. And you were exposed to all the other photographers, and that's how you learned. And it took a while. It took at least 7 years, maybe 8 years, and I became a photographer. So they would send me on different assignments as a rookie. I would do, the big thing in those days was ship news. I mean, I photographed interesting things. I photographed the Beatles when they came to New York, the day they flew into New York. Or no, may have been, I forget already. I think it was in a boat. I don't remember. But I did artists, I did things like that, and I did photograph the Beatles on their entrance to New York. And so I did that for the first year. After that, it was bye-bye. I went on the night shift. I worked from 1 o'clock in the morning to 9 o'clock in the morning. And I covered crime. I was in a radio car listening to murders, you name it. I would cover them, and I would ride around with police radios. I would ride like a cop. I mean, I zoomed to assignments. You hear it on the radio, there's shooting here, shooting, whatever. And that's what I did for, 9 years. I remember one time there was I heard about a fire in Queens, and I drove over to the fire in Queens, and the first thing, I pulled into the scene, and the first thing I saw was a fire engine on fire. The place was crazy, you know. And and I remember it was close. It was close to morning, and I called the city desk, and I said, I think you should alert the day shift about this fire. Anyway, I had a tremendous career on the night shift, and I did very well. I worked very hard, and then I was rewarded. In 1970, they asked me to go on the work for the borough, be the Queensborough photographer. In the 10 months I worked there, every big story in America seemed to be out of Queens. I had the exclusive photographs of the first bomb on a plane. I was driving around a radio car, and I heard the call for a bomb at the airport, at Kennedy Airport. And I got to the police station at the airport. I stopped my car, took my camera out, and just as I got there, the door opened from the police station, and a cop came out holding the bomb out in front of him on a stick. And he had a helmet on, looked like a knight's helmet, and he walked out with the bomb on a stick. That was the first thing I saw. And got it exclusively. Picture went all over the world. It was the first bomb on a plane in the United States, as far as I know. A lot of accolades for that, and a lot of other things happened, front pages and stuff. And so I spent 10 months in there, and finally, I had some difficulty with the district attorney's office. They never let me get pictures. The district attorney never let me get a picture that he wanted to be in at all. If there was a prisoner anywhere, the only picture I could get was a district attorney. So I went to my boss. I said, "Can I get out of here?" And the boss looked at me and said, "What took you so long to ask?" I was sent to New York. I left Queens in 1970 after being there 10 months. I went on to the city and became one of the regulars in the city. And I did whatever work had to be done in the city, which was really a lot of personalities. I remember one of the first jobs I had, I went to some showgirl. There was some story, I don't remember what it was. And I got in to the room with the showgirl, and the first thing she did, she took off her blouse and her brassiere and said, "Is this what you want?" And I said, "Wait a minute, lady, I work for a family newspaper. Please, put it back." Which she did. And that was the kind of crazy stuff you did. We did all the celebrities at a time, and things were going well. And then the newspaper business, we were a black and white newspaper, and things were starting to go into color. The powers that be decided that they had to train photographers in color photography. And the photographers that were doing color photography were in the magazine. So they decided to take a photographer from the regular photo department and move him into the magazine for 6 months. The man in charge of photography was an old friend of mine, and he said, "Ken, I want you to go." Well, knowing the man for many years, I couldn't refuse. And I said, "Fine." Again, me not knowing anything about color photography, but I learned. I learned in a hurry. I was the one guy that went in, and I stayed in. And so my career, a new career started with me, and I spent many years. I probably worked from the magazine from probably 1971 or 2 to probably about 1980 1985. And at some point, television was taking over the industry. And so cost became very important. So they decided to do away with the magazine. And so they offered me a job to finish out my career by working for the Long Island Bureau. So it was my job to cover everything that was happening on Long Island. But the beautiful part about it is I could operate out of my home. So when I get up in the morning, I would check all the available news events that were going on. And I would cover any news events that would break. The office would call me. It was a murder or robbery or whatever. Anything, politician. I mean, I photographed, the governors. I covered races, governors' races, and things like that. So I finished out my career on Long Island, and I retired in 1991. I'll tell you, it was a miracle that I met your grandma. I look at it as fate. Your grandma was going to have a Sweet 16 party. The word went out she wanted friends, and they wanted some boys to come to the Sweet 16 party. And I was invited by one of her friends. I didn't know the girl. I never quite understood how I managed to get invited, but I did. And I looked at it as fate. I still don't know the girl. I don't remember her. All I remember is I went to the party, and there's where I met you. I met your grandma, and I asked her for a date because she looked very attractive to me. And she said, okay. And that was probably the best day of my life, the day that I met her. She was the most unselfish person I knew. I took Anita with me to the proms, and we had a great time. And when we met, I hadn't had the job yet. I was just still a junior in high school. So I didn't really get a job. We were just kids, and I didn't get a real job until I was 18, when I got a job as an office boy, a temporary office boy with the New York Daily News. But I fell in love with her. It was just fabulous. She was just a beautiful baby, really, at 16, and she just got better looking and better looking and better looking. And she was gorgeous. and I was thrilled. We stayed together for I would say, probably from 47, probably 47 to 2013. 1947, 2013, we were a couple. I had to balance my family life with this unusual working situation, and it worked out very well. My wife, Anita, she took to it very well. I was working at the paper, and in 1957, my first child, Bernard, Buddy, was born, and shortly thereafter I moved out of our apartment in New York City, the Bronx. I moved into our new home in Plainview, New York, right on Long Island, and we had the little boy, and I continued my work, and we had purchased a little car, and everything was going smoothly. And so Buddy was brought up with the love and affection of his family. And 3 years later, we had Michael, and Michael was born, and I was still in the night shift, and Anita took care of both of the boys when I was away at work. And 3 years later, Cliff was born, and so we had 3 children. I remained on the night shift, and I was able to bring them home a couple of sandwiches and cheesecake from a track, and the boys would wait up until I came home on Saturday nights, and they would have a ball waiting and eating, and had a great old time. I moved on to a bigger and newer home in Dix Hills, and by this point in time we had 2 cars. We drove a lot with the children. We took them places, and I remember, I'm just thinking of the one big trip I took in 1969, where I did a 31-day trip with the boys and Anita, and we drove from our home in New York, and we stopped everywhere. We stopped in the Mount Rushmore, and we kept on going. We went to every conceivable historical and place that people go to en route, and we stopped in the national parks, and we went to Disneyland, and we went to several other parks out on the West Coast. We visited my wife's brother over in the San Francisco area, and we drove around, headed back. We stopped to Las Vegas and drove back, and that was a wonderful 31-day family trip. As the boys were now much older, I was able to take them with me on assignments, and all my boys went with me on one time or another. We covered everything from professional football, professional hockey, you name it. They were able to go along with me, and it was a very satisfying time for them and for me. As the boys grew older, they were in working situations, of course. They graduated. Buddy graduated college, and I remember he moved on to Kentucky, and I visited him, of course. And Michael, he graduated from NYU, and he went over to, I remember after he graduated, he landed a job in the San Francisco area, and well, I remember driving Michael to San Francisco. We had a trip, just father and son trip, where I drove him to San Francisco, which was very interesting. And Cliff was still in college at this time, and so it was very difficult for me to keep up. Buddy changed his situation, and he moved to Indiana, and Michael moved to Los Angeles, and and then Michael moved to Connecticut, and the boys were all over the place, and so it was time for me to move on, and I wanted to just spend my time with my wife. I did retire, and I decided a little earlier, that I would move to the Las Vegas area. Moved into an apartment with my wife Anita, and by this time the boys were off on their own, because the boys kind of moved around a lot in those days, and I said, wow, I did one job for 43 years, and these guys are moving all around the country, one end to the other. So I said, I got to go to a place that's kind of in the middle, and I chose Las Vegas. From there, we purchased a home in Green Valley, Henderson, and it was a beautiful house. And while the boys didn't live with us, they'd come to see us, so we went to see them. And at some point, Cliff lived with us for a short time with his friend, Joy Banerjee, and then he moved off on his own. He went to work for one of the casinos in Vegas, and he became very interested in kind of the nursing business. He became a I guess a security guy, and he took courses, and he was a security guy that had I forget what they call it, but he was able to treat people in the casino who were ill, and he liked that so much that he ultimately became a nurse, a registered nurse. Michael became a certified accountant, and got a job with a large accounting firm, and his career started, and he did very well. Buddy went to nursing school and became a full-fledged registered nurse, which he still is today, and now he's in charge of the area that he works in, and he's doing very well. And my kids were all financially secure. Unfortunately, I lost my youngest, Cliff, in an automobile accident, and it was the hardest moment of my life and my wife's life, and only because we loved each other so much that we leaned on each other and went through that terrible time, and we survived it. But losing Cliff was the worst thing in our lives. And the best thing in our lives were our children and our grandchildren. And life is what it is, and life is what you make of it. And Nita and I, we did the best we could. We always did the best we could for our family, for ourselves. And so on with my life. I'm not getting any younger, but my life changed, and I reverted back to my youth. And I started to be an entertainer again. I decided I could sing, and so I started singing. Joined a singing group, and I became one of the featured performers, and things were moving along, and things happened. I lost my beautiful wife. She passed on in 2013, and life went on, and I'm sure she wanted me to continue singing and enjoying my life, and so I'm out there today, and I'm going to be out there tonight singing away.
pennies from heaven. Don't you know it's not the same? No pennies from heaven. You'll find your fortune falling all over the town. Be sure that your umbrella is upside down. Pennies from heaven. Pennies from heaven. Pennies from heaven for you and me. Hey, those pennies from heaven. Thank you.
But that's life, and I've lived it, I think, to the fullest. I had a wonderful life. I had wonderful children, grandchildren. I would say I had a perfect life, and when my time comes, love you, bye.